it is an act of humility, going back and saying, actually, we really knew what we were doing 100 years ago.
Greetings, Earthlings, and welcome back to your podcast, the show where we imagine a future that doesn't make us wretch. Today on the show, we're going to take another look at how we can evolve one of those very basic requirements of human existence, shelter, and how we can rethink buildings into structures that can serve us and the planet versus harming our bodies, the environment, and society. And the guest who's going to guide us to imagining this future that's actually already happening is someone who's been active in the built environment for nearly 20 years, going all the way back to the early days of the green building LEED certification movement. But before we get there, I'm your host, Lisa Ann Pinkerton. I support startups in gaining media exposure through leading Technica Communications, and I support all genders in their careers with women in clean tech and sustainability. If you've listened to a few of our episodes, I'll wager to guess you're enjoying the show. And if you are, I encourage you to become a supporting member. And the most valuable thing that you can do, and frankly, the easiest thing, is to go to your podcast app right now, scroll to our show, scroll all the way down to where there are the reviews, and leave us a few stars. 5 stars would be amazing, and I encourage you to leave as many stars as you think we are worthy of. Earthlings, we have tackled the built environment in 2 episodes so far of our show. The first one was on the smart building home upgrade and how people could use the IRA to bring smart energy solutions into their home. And also we talked to Lindsay Wood, the tiny home lady, about this movement of smaller spaces for living. And today we're talking to another Lindsay on how we can encourage the building and construction industry to create a regenerative built environment. Imagine if buildings did more than shelter us and make us sick. What if the materials and the way we used water and energy all contributed to health, happiness, beauty, and equity? And it's not a far-fetched idea. It's actually happening right now with building owners and architects taking on the Living Building Challenge. Before you get your inner skeptic scoffing at me, the sick building syndrome is actually a real thing. And it's been around since the 1980s. In fact, the World Health Organization actually first coined the term. And if you think about it, it makes sense. We're in these buildings, they're clamped down, full of plastics, solvents, adhesives, a plethora of chemicals that can all contribute to this constellation of symptoms that can result in like this subtle sickly feeling. And you don't even know that it's the environment around you that is contributing to that illness. I know somebody who suffered from flu-like symptoms for years until he finally found out that it was mold that he was allergic to. And then, of course, you've got bad lighting, which contributes to headaches and eye strain. Buildings that are too cold, even in the summertime. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So to help us navigate this new future that's coming, we are joined by Lindsay Baker. She's the CEO of the International Living Future Institute and its Chief Strategist. The nonprofit has been advocating for living buildings for the past 40 years, and they do it through this Living Building Challenge along with other initiatives. Lindsay herself is a longtime climate movement leader, successful startup entrepreneur, and a building scientist. She served on the board of directors for Measurable. She was WeWork's first global sustainability leader. She founded and led Building Robotics for 5 years to a successful exit, mind you. And she was a member of Google's Green Team focused on sustainable operations.
I am really passionate about working in the built environment because it's a really delightful place to work on climate solutions with people who fundamentally care about how best to shelter other people. It's just a really great community. So I've always felt like I belonged here and it felt like a great industry and professional world to be in.
Thank you, Lindsay. I mean, they say that, shelter is one of our core needs as humans. So for you to spend your focus and time on protecting us very vulnerable meat sacks that we have on this planet. We don't have claws, we don't have fur, like we're very, very vulnerable in terms of the elements. So the fact that you're focusing on this for us, I really appreciate, because, you and I go way back, and it's almost like the environment's not going to get any easier for the built environment in terms of climate change and whatnot. So thinking about how all this works together is going to be critical for our near future.
It's so true. And I just really believe like everything about working on how we make ourselves able to withstand, increasing climate disasters. It turns out those things also really help to mitigate climate change. So it's just kind of it's a win-win.
Oh, I like that. Well, that's what we're going to explore today. So we did a show, Life at 3C, last season, and we covered sort of how life is going to dramatically change on this planet in terms of like heat waves and rising sea levels and all of this stuff. So how do you predict that the built environment and the building industry is adjusting to these upcoming challenges?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're seeing it this summer, right, all over the US, that folks who live in cooler climates are suddenly feeling these heat waves, and their homes and schools and other kinds of spaces aren't always able to really respond, right, to how hot it gets to keep us cool inside. So it's feeling particularly relevant this summer to think about it. And I think we're experiencing in the building industry that there's sort of a higher level of awareness than there used to be amongst the sort of overall general public on the kind of work that we do, which is great, but also sad because we have so much work to do, really, and so little time. I think one of the ways the building industry is responding that's most critical is how we're going to renovate all of these buildings. It's actually a lot easier for us to figure out how to build buildings that can withstand extreme temperatures from scratch. A lot of buildings that have been built more recently, that are built to modern codes, are pretty good on that front, and a lot of folks have installed air conditioning in many parts of the world, even if the climate didn't necessarily need it, because everybody loves an air conditioner. But how we're going to do that while also tackling climate change, all of those things are actually really challenging when you look at not just, resilience, keeping ourselves comfortable and safe during climate disaster, but then also reducing the overall, carbon emissions. Of course, for a lot of folks, the way that we stay cool when it's really hot out is something that contributes overall to more global warming, right? Of putting more CO2 into the atmosphere. So the great part of it actually is that we knew how to build well before air conditioning and electric light and all of these things were invented that really increased the amount of global carbon emissions we put out into the world. I mean, when you think about it that way, that we just really rapidly increased the amount of carbon emissions in the past 20 years that have gone into the atmosphere. And yet we have been sheltering ourselves for thousands of years. And so we know that it is possible to do this with low carbon emissions because we used to do it. And a lot of the techniques and strategies and things we're trying to use nowadays, even when it comes to renovations, are going back to techniques that people have known about for a long time, shading the buildings, shading windows, and using ceiling fans more effectively, or just air movement,
I lived in a Victorian house when I was just out of college in Michigan, and Michigan's very humid in the summertime. Like, you sit and sweat. Like, it can be brutal. But this Victorian house was built in such a way that if we opened up all the windows, it was cool. And I was always felt very impressed that before air conditioning and all this stuff, architects, I think this is an 1889 house that I lived in, right? Like, they understood it, right? And we know that you can live under, like, if you have part of your house underground, it's going to stay cool, right? My Michigan basement was always 62 degrees. It was always freezing down there, right? But these are things that we have known about for a long time.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, I mean, we love believing this narrative that we've gotten so much more sophisticated over the past, whatever amount of time our own lives have been in. And I have to say, in the case of buildings, sometimes in the past 100 years, we got less sophisticated. We basically started realizing, like, oh, wait a second, we can build these buildings that are completely dumb, but then it won't matter because we're going to pump them full of cold air that we made from burning fossil fuels. And like, we don't have to, use that intelligence. So I think it's kind of, it is an act of humility going back and saying, actually, we really knew what we were doing 100 years ago. All that stuff really works. But the good news is we still have it. And we had a lot of buildings that, there are even public school buildings. I used to work a lot on public schools, and there were buildings that were built around that same time that your Victorian house was built. And they had natural ventilation techniques actually built into these, like, oftentimes brick school buildings. So they would have sort of, vents and things designed into the actual structures. And then in the 50s, 60s, 70s, they closed them off. They didn't know what they were for, and they were starting to, get air conditioning in the schools or whatever. So sometimes the act of getting a building to be more resilient to climate change can actually be to just literally unbuild some of the structures that we created for ourselves during these times when we got really, excited about fossil fuels and all of the things we could do with our, nearly free energy source.
And what about some of the specific features or technologies that you see being implemented today, or you're tracking, that are going to help us manage, the climate crisis challenge that's coming?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things. Actually, one of the things I get excited about these days is architecture firms and practices in the global South. In particular, there's one firm I'm a really big fan of called Mass Design Group that's doing really advanced work around, like, earth construction. So it's basically saying, okay, we're not building with mud anymore. We're building with super advanced rammed earth structures that are essentially turned into commercial buildings, like big buildings. I think there's a stereotype that if you're building a big, professionally built building, you're going to build with concrete and steel and glass. And like, that's how we build. But there are people all over the world now showing that you can build these very, professional commercial office buildings or whatever it is out of materials that are local with local labor that have very low carbon footprints. And all of those sort of bio-based materials and practices that are really grounded in a local economy and what it needs to thrive are such a big part of climate resilience, right? Because it means fewer climate refugees, frankly. If folks can have those jobs and they're staying in their communities and their buildings are built for their climate, it's just like a win on every front, right? Like, it's all the things. It's not just a question of how do we reduce our carbon footprint. We can tackle all of these intersecting issues around climate through how we build, creating jobs, creating ways for people to stay comfortable and in their communities, like the creation of community that happens when you build a building together. Like, all that stuff can build resilience in multiple sort of ways. So all of that. And I mean, it's, it's earth and construction in some parts of the world. It's mass timber construction in other parts of the world. Just, great renovation technologies. There are a lot more things. I'm a fan of, there's companies like Gradient that are doing a wonderful job of getting heat pumps for residential homes that are easier for people to put in and kind of, make the switch to electric heat pumps and get rid of the natural gas in their homes. So, like, lots of stuff that's coming out that just helps us do this. I don't know, the list goes on. There's not quite enough. Like, I live in a tall glass building, ironically, and it's not great at keeping the heat out. And we could really use better technologies for windows. Window retrofits are one of the most expensive things out there when it comes to energy retrofits in buildings. And it's not really getting cheaper. So, like, if there are technology entrepreneurs out there listening, please help us create some new windows or something cheaper we can do with windows that lets us, get in there and give people better insulation from the outdoors without spending like tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars doing it. But yeah, aside from that, we're doing okay.
So I hear a lot about different certifications that are out there for buildings, and one that you all have, that you have this initiative called the Living Building Challenge, and you're inspiring these architects and builders to think more holistically about the structures they build. Can you tell us a bit more about what this challenge is and what does it entail?
The Living Building Challenge has been around for about 15 years now. We just certified our 33rd building as a fully living building. So it's not meant to be easy, and it's also not really meant to be something for every building out there in the world. But basically, a fully living building is a building that generates more energy on site than it consumes. It treats all of its own water on site, such that it can be water positive. It is completely free of chemicals that are known to be toxic to humans in any way. And then there are a handful of other features about it around community, how it engages and creates economic opportunity for the community, how it welcomes the community in, landscape, transit, access, all these kinds of things that really have been written in a way to define what it means for a building to truly give back more positive impact to the world than what it takes. And that is actually a really hard thing to do. I was just noticing the other day, like a shoe company launched a shoe that's actually carbon positive. And it was like this big deal. Like no one's ever made a shoe that was better for the world than what it took out, and like that term carbon positive can be a little bit fuzzy. But what we basically do is try to define that, not just on carbon, but on human health and on social impact. And we challenge architects and engineers and owners to see if they can build a building that really does that in the world. And we run the program really to inspire people and show what is possible, how we can build today. So I think a lot of us think that the idea that we could build a carbon positive building feels impossible or just feels like so far off, but it's entirely possible,
Or it's going to look like one of those Earth ships in Taos, New Mexico, which is all made out of, waste products, which are awesome. And they recycle. They reuse all that water like 5 times before it actually irrigates the plants. And it's amazing what those Earth ships can do.
Yeah.
But most people don't want to live in one of those or work in one of those.
Exactly. Yeah. So the kinds of buildings that we have now, that are actual living buildings are, we have office buildings that are 6, 7, 8 stories tall. We have, laboratory facilities. We have like totally normal office buildings. Of course, they don't look totally normal because it turns out when you try to build without, plastics, you end up looking a little bit better than you otherwise would. But it's not really, it's not, as you're saying, it's not Earth ships. It's not like living in an igloo or something. It's these, beautiful buildings. And importantly, part of the challenge is also about then educating and bringing people into the space. You have to hold an open house every year. And yeah, we just think buildings are, I feel so lucky. It's not just that like people who work on buildings are really delightful. It's also that buildings are this incredible visceral way for people to experience what the future could feel like. And when we work on these kinds of living buildings, I just can't even tell you the number of times people come up to me and say, I walked through a living building and it changed me completely from being someone that felt like we were beyond repair on climate change. How could we possibly tackle this thing? To understanding, oh, it's possible. This is what it will feel like. This is reasonable. Let's get down to it, and like deal with whatever climate solutions we have available to us in our industry or in our community or whatever.
I love that you bring that up because my fiance was an architecture student, and he talked about how architecture was meant to create communication. And that's what he took from his, his studies of the field, that he wanted to create these spaces that would bring people together and help them better communicate and interact with each other. And I think we take a lot for granted in terms of how buildings are built and how much thought goes in to the design of these buildings and the literal sweat, blood, and tears that it takes to put up some of this infrastructure. I'm curious to hear, do you have an example of one of your certified buildings that you could tell us about so we could get more of a picture of how these operate?
I'll share one of my favorites. It's hard to pick. I think a lot of people like to talk about, there's a building called the Bullitt Center in Seattle, Washington. So if you're like a Northwest person, go look into that one. But I'm going to tell you about the Kendeda building in Atlanta, Georgia. It's on the Georgia Tech campus. And I'm from Atlanta. And so I'm really partial to it because, as we were just talking about, like, I grew up with a healthy addiction to air conditioning, and the idea of building in Atlanta in a really hot, humid climate and still being able to build where you use all of these kind of different technologies than you would normally use in a building to keep it cool, it makes a lot of people nervous. And so the Kendeda building has done an incredible job. It's a classroom building, so I think it's maybe, I don't know, 3 or 4 stories tall, and it's in the middle of Georgia Tech's campus. It's been around for a couple of years, but they have like an edible landscape on the roof. They have blueberries and a little farm kind of up there with people cultivating bees. There's beekeepers and all of that on the site. The solar panels for these buildings oftentimes extend beyond the roof line so that you can get enough solar. So they kind of create this canopy. There's actually a really nice shade for walking around the building in the summertime because it keeps the sun off of you while also harvesting the sun's energy to fuel, to energize the building. But yeah, they have, super cool, like, foamy toilets that use very, very little water so that it's like a foam that pulls all the stuff from the toilet down into a composting toilet system. There's all these kinds of things. But again, it's not, these are not normal composting toilets. These are lovely ones that are fun.
Well, actually, I know people who have composting toilets and they love them.
Yeah, nothing wrong with it,
And I've never heard of a building using composting toilets. I've always heard of like tiny houses or mobile camping, cabin, sort of off-grid experiences using them.
Yeah, no, you can use them. I mean, it's it requires somebody who's going to kind of pay attention to things, and they run a little bit differently than other toilets do. But again, it's kind of about breaking down, like, well, I mean, just because we've used this particular type of vacuum-style water-based toilet for the past 100 years doesn't mean we're not capable of better things or different design. So, it's all about kind of being at that vanguard edge and trying new things and then sharing with the industry what's working and what we think everybody can use, and just sort of continuing along that innovative edge, I guess.
I like that. I like that you're sharing how every building sort of learns from the ones before it when you're trying to do something different than the status quo. I appreciate that you mentioned the concept of plastics and petrochemicals in buildings, because I think a lot of people don't really realize how subtle those can impact the human body in a negative way. What's been your experience?
Oh my goodness, so many things. Well, the first thing I'll say is we have a program that folks should check out on our website that's called the Red List, and it's our program that helps to screen building materials for a set of chemicals that are known to be harmful for human health, especially carcinogenic materials. There's a lot of plastics. We've been particularly active around PFAS chemicals, which have been in the news a lot recently. there is a ton of PFAS in building materials. And I think somehow people don't always make the connection, but you think about like a lot of flooring, for example, it looks like wood, but it's actually vinyl. And so that vinyl oftentimes, it is PVC, it's polyvinyl chloride. It's the same stuff that was in the train that crashed in East Palestine, Ohio, and destroyed an ecosystem and communities and all sorts of things, and has produced millions upon millions of dollars of damage. So that's that stuff. That's the same material. So when we talk about trying to get those materials out of buildings, as you can probably guess, it's not just a climate thing. It's also a human health thing.
I think a lot about how we're building our buildings, and I think people people are pretty familiar with what the green building certification, and maybe slightly fewer people know about passive house design. How does the Living Building Challenge fit in with those other types of certifications, and how should we think about all of them together?
So LEED, for example, was sort of first, green building certification. I worked on that. I was there 20 years ago. And the idea then, and this is still sort of how LEED works, is it gives you a menu of options and you pick a bunch of them. And if you pick enough of them, you get certified. And then you can pick more of them and you get silver and platinum and all of that. It was really just meant to sort of say to people, these are all the things you can and should be thinking about. Get after it, see what you can do, and we'll give you recognition at the end once you've documented that you've done all those things. So it was across the board: health, energy, all sorts of things, water, all that. But it was more like a pick and choose. So the Living Building Challenge basically says, if you want to get this designation, you have to do all the things that we think require a building to really become positive. And we also run a program called our Zero Carbon Certification Program, which is really about defining buildings that have gotten to just that carbon level. And it's very popular with companies that have made carbon commitments around reduction of their overall carbon footprint for the company, because they're basically looking to document progress towards a climate goal. And then on the passive house side, I guess I'll just point out, it's just about energy that is operational energy. It's just about how to really reduce the amount of energy that you consume in the building by making it super tight. The envelope is tight, so you're not going to lose a lot of heat or a lot of cool, through the envelope itself. So that's what it's good at. So it's a much more specific program. And there are lots of other specific programs, like there's a program called WELL that just focuses on the health impacts of buildings. FitWell is another one of those. It's just about health. So yeah, we're kind of embarrassing in the number of certifications we have in the building industry for different things.
Yeah, it is a little fragmented, but I think it makes sense that certain things can be used for certain goals, right? And I guess the onus is on the architect, the builder, and ultimately the end user or building owner to sort of decide, okay, how do we want to go about this building in the most responsible way for us and our goals and what we care about?
Yeah, and that's where I guess I'll just say what we mostly do is work with people who want to build buildings that can be beacons for change in their community. So they're really, really trying to do something that exemplifies climate action, or what it truly means to be a non-toxic building.
Can you imagine if every commercial real estate agent was presented with the question, excuse me, is this a toxic building or a non-toxic building? Because I only want to be looking at non-toxic properties.
Right? Yeah, I know. And the sad thing is, if you asked a real estate agent that today, they would probably be like, oh, so what do you mean? It's completely non-toxic. And then you'd be like, but this is vinyl and this is vinyl and this is but just it's not known. But we need to work on that. We're going to work on that.
We are, and the industry it's moving along. Probably not as fast as maybe some of us would like, but it takes a lot of time and effort to build these buildings. There's permitting, there's planning. What do you think we can do to reduce this lag time?
Oh gosh, there's so many things. I mean, in one way, I think it's just, it's good to recognize in the building industry, there are lots of good reasons why we've built up all of these sort of regulations. And it's for worker safety, it's for environmental safety. There's all sorts of stuff, right? Liability, something that America is great at, like adding levels of bureaucracy around. I mean, I get really excited about modular and prefab construction techniques, things that sort of reduce the amount of on-site fabrication that's happening, because I think those kinds of technology companies and sort of processes that people are creating are really helping to cut down the amount of time. Because, part of why we're so regulated, why it takes so long, is that every building is its own special snowflake. So if fewer buildings were actually special snowflakes and they were more, more similar, more modularized, et cetera, than uniform, then you'd be able to produce them more quickly, and that would be helpful. I think there's also just it's interesting. Sometimes it's easier to build these kinds of buildings in the global South, in parts of the world that haven't built up the same amount of regulation that we have. And I'm starting to realize, as I've been talking to folks, like, why is that you can kind of build a super, super regenerative building in Rwanda that works great and all of these things, with materials from on site, there's a lot. And you can't do that here. And I think it also just comes down to how building regulations have actually been really actively influenced by manufacturing companies who wanted to see their products used. And so the more we can try to shift the way that our regulations around buildings are made and allow them to more specifically have the goals of climate action, the better. There's a lot of folks who are getting on these committees to make sure that the codes and regulations have those goals and don't have competing goals around other people's desire to make sure that you can still put your natural gas appliances in the building if you want to, or you can still put all of your really, really great vinyl products in the building if you want to, right? It's just, capitalism is a factor, I guess, is maybe one way of putting it.
I mean, we should try and reduce the amount of regulatory capture that happens in our country. I'm shocked.
Shocking.
Yes, it sounds like, because as I understand it, building codes, like there's the attitude of, oh, well, I'm only going to do what's in the building code. It's not in the building code, or that's my, I think they're supposed to be seen as like the bare minimum, but I think people see them as the be all end all, and they're not doing anything beyond that. And then it takes however many years. I feel I was talking to somebody at a networking event or something, and he was saying, we're working on solidifying the building codes, for 3 years from now or something like that.
So many years, right? Because if you start working on an update for a building code right now, then it's going to take however many 3 years, 4 years to actually get it enacted. And then here in the US also, like in Canada, there's one building code for the whole country. Here in the US, there's a model code for the whole country, and then cities and states decide if they want to adopt it or not. And so a lot of cities are stuck on a model building code that was written for the US 10, 15, 20 years ago. And since there's been more progress on energy requirements and air, and health and all these things, they haven't adopted them. And sometimes that is political. It's like people see that and say, oh, this is climate stuff and we don't want it in our building codes. And so they don't adopt it. It can also be cost things, a lot of times. Efficiency measures or other things they can add some cost compared to not doing them. But again, that goes back to this resilience point. It's, cost in the short term to build the building better is usually a savings in the long run because it operates cheaper. So kind of, you really got to ask yourself, who is it more expensive for? And
Right. Well, that comes back to the end user or the end building owner dictating some of that, right? Because they're the ones that are going to be enjoying those cost savings. But it's not always the developer that gets to enjoy those savings. It actually makes the project more expensive for them, so they don't have an incentive to do it.
it's wild. Like, even, I think, I don't want to get this wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's just been in the past couple of years that there's actually been a new standard passed for the construction of manufactured homes in the US. And I think either there hadn't been one or there hadn't been any changes to it in like 30 years. And so the manufacturers of manufactured homes, which are, a lot of folks, so I'm talking like, you might think of them as trailers, or you might think of them as, variety of different kinds of homes like that. Double wides, yep. Yeah, a lot of people live in those homes in America. And so, yeah, it's important for us to ask the question, especially when you see that those folks are disproportionately have their homes and communities ruined in climate disasters. So, like, who's regulating that? The answer has kind of been nobody recently, but we're finally pushing on that to make sure that those homes are built up to higher standards around, what our weather and landscape looks like and what we want to achieve from a climate perspective.
And also from an enjoyment perspective, I have had some experience with mobile homes and double wides in my youth. And I remember being in those buildings thinking, wow, this really wasn't built very well. Wow, this doesn't really make me feel good as a human, right? And we think about the housing crisis and how there's just not enough homes for everybody. Naturally, you think, well, let's have smaller homes. Let's have, tiny home communities. And then people are like, no, I don't want, crappy mobile park in my neighborhood. And people are trying to say, no, these homes are better made. They're made more structurally sound. They're more energy efficient. They're actually better homes. They're just smaller.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I totally love people who have decided to live in a mobile home because they like the community.
Yes.
Like, a lot of folks are tired or whatever. It's a beautiful thing. And the only part about it that's hard for us here is the stereotypes that we apply to those kinds of ways of living, that type of space. But as you said, also just the standards to which they're built, right? I mean, if you build it with a bunch of stuff that's going to harm our health, or if they're not built with good ventilation or light or any of those things, that's not okay. But yeah, we as a community and as a political body have the choice to make those standards higher so everybody has a good quality of life,
Everybody deserves a living situation that helps them to feel valued as a human being.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And even if that's a subtle experience, like most people aren't even aware that they may be feeling the opposite, living in whatever situation they're in. But it has a subtle yet profound effect on your perspective on life and how you go about this game of life.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, sometimes it's very visceral. There's all this wonderful research that's been done in the past couple decades around the importance of natural light on our mental health, but also on our physical health. Like they've looked at.
You mean getting outside and being in the sun is actually good for you?
Weird. Science shows that it is actually really good for you. Yeah, it makes you heal faster after surgeries if you have like a view to nature out of your window versus no window, or like a view to not nature. It's a real thing.
Oh, absolutely. It's a real thing. I had a friend who, and they could help you just emotionally too. I had a friend tell me once, he's kind of like an urban shaman. And he was like, when you're ever upset or frustrated, just go outside, go hang out with the plants, the trees, go let your hand rub against the bushes, right? Because nature, it's designed to pull negativity off of you.
Exactly.
Energetically. That's what it's there for.
Oh, I love that. I love that way of putting it. That's really powerful.
So listeners out there, if you don't have a plant in your house, you get a chance to go adopt one. Become a plant parent.
It's very fulfilling. I can testify that with my 2 plant babies on either side. They keep me company. And yeah, I mean, even just like, I just like the way that, when the wind's blowing on the sky, it kind of moves around. It makes me happy.
Yeah. So we're coming up on time, and I want to be conscious of that. I do want to ask you, though, what do you think we can expect from your professional experience? Because you've been in the building industry for a long time. You have quite a perspective, and I'm curious to know, what can we expect from the buildings that we live and work and play in the next 20, 30 years? What's your prediction?
Oh, I love that question. I mean, because I could answer that 2 ways, but one of the ways I want to answer it is saying that we should all expect that our homes and buildings and schools, all of these things, don't make us sick. That's a really good fundamental one to start with. I think we don't always tune into that question, right? When we have wildfire smoke and it's impacting our community, you should be able to be in a home that keeps you safe from that smoke. That's a reasonable expectation, and a lot of people don't have that. And I think somehow it doesn't occur to them, I should ask more, I should demand more of my building because it should be able to take care of this for me. And many buildings do and many buildings don't. So all of us, I think, should expect that. But yeah, I'm excited. I actually think some of the things that we should expect to see in the way that we build change is that we're going to build with more bio-based materials. A friend of mine, so his name is David Arkin. He's a great architect, wonderful guy. We were on a Zoom call yesterday and he said, maybe we need a new motto that's kind of like Michael Pollan's advice for food, which I don't know if you've heard, but Michael Pollan says, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. That's his mantra about he's like, that's the only diet I've ever really thought was worth anything. And David said, what if it was build shelter, not too big, mostly plants? And I was like, well, there you go. That is just about all we need to tell people here, just build shelter, not too big, mostly plants. We have so many of the materials that we're capable of building with are low carbon footprint materials today. And yes, it's going to be great for us to try to develop new technologies to lower the carbon footprint of things like cement and steel and concrete, all of that. But today we can build that way with natural materials that are going to ultimately have just a much lower carbon footprint, and also they feel great, right? Wood in a space. I don't know if folks haven't gone into a building that was built with mass timber, just walk through it and just feel the feeling like you were talking about having plants in your building. Imagine, or in your space in your home. Imagine that just everything around you feels like a material that comes from nature. It's, it's earth, it's wood, it's stone, all of these things. They feel great and they are better for us. So I look forward to that. I think we're going to start to realize that we kind of went down a road we didn't need to go down with all these plastics and petrochemicals and carbon emitting things. But I think the more that we all just sort of ask ourselves those fundamental questions about what we buy and set our sights out for buildings that feel like that and look like that, the easier it will be for us to structure all of the necessary financing mechanisms and other things that are definitely behind, under the hood on making that transformation happen.
Wow. Earthlings. Mic drop. What boggles my mind is how much of the 21st century is focused on unraveling the assumptions of past generations and their technology solutions. We're seeing that with fossil fuel usage and automobiles, energy, medicine, plastics, housing, education, psychology, and now large buildings. Kudos to Lindsay and her Living Building Challenge. We're looking forward to seeing more of these buildings in the future. Speaking of bringing things back to the way they once were, our faith in humanity is restored this week through the efforts of Sebastião and Lélia Salgado. They are a Brazilian couple that brought back a barren wasteland devoid of wildlife to a thriving forest. Their project is called Instituto Terra, and it spanned 20 years and reforested 555 acres or more by now, and has employed over 70 people. They started with 200 species of plants and narrowed things down to about 100 that really worked well. And they pot on average 18,000 plants a day. Today they have a thriving forest full of wildlife, and they have converted unimaginable tons of carbon dioxide into oxygen. We salute Sebastião and Lélia and all the people of Instituto Terra. Thank you for your efforts. This story is a powerful reminder of the potential of human determination and dedication to heal our world. I hope you will ponder how you can do the same for this beautiful blue-green space flower we call home.